Butyrka Prison stands as one of the most feared and historically significant prisons in Russia. Located in Moscow, this fortress-like institution has witnessed centuries of political repression, criminal justice, and human suffering. From the era of the Russian Tsars to the Soviet Union and into modern Russia, Butyrka has remained a symbol of state power and punishment. Butyrka Prison traces its origins back to the late 18th century, during the rule of the Russian Empire, a time when the state sought stronger control over crime and dissent. Established in 1771 under Empress Catherine the Great, the prison was initially designed as a holding facility for criminals awaiting trial or punishment. Its creation reflected the growing need of the empire to centralize authority and enforce law and order in an expanding and increasingly complex society. From its earliest days, Butyrka was not just a place for ordinary criminals. The prison quickly became a tool of the state, used to detain individuals considered dangerous to political stability. Rebels, reformists, and critics of imperial policies were often confined within its walls. This dual purpose, housing criminals and silencing opposition, set the tone for Butyrka's future role in Russian history. Architecturally, Butyrka was designed to project power and intimidation. Thick stone walls, narrow corridors, and heavily guarded cells reflected the philosophy of punishment prevalent at the time. The prison's fortress-like structure served as a physical manifestation of state authority, sending a clear message to society about the consequences of defying the law or challenging the ruling elite. As Russia moved into the 19th century, Butyrka's function expanded alongside the empire's political struggles. Revolutionary ideas began to spread among intellectuals, workers, and students, and the prison increasingly held individuals accused of subversion. Many inmates were detained not for violent crimes, but for distributing pamphlets, participating in secret meetings, or expressing dissenting opinions. During this period, Butyrka gained a reputation as a place of prolonged detention rather than swift justice. Prisoners often spent months or even years awaiting trial, living in uncertainty. This practice reflected the broader inefficiencies and harsh realities of the imperial legal system, where the process itself became a form of punishment. The prison also served as a transit point for prisoners destined for exile in Siberia. Many inmates passed through Butyrka before being sent to labor camps or remote settlements. For these individuals, Butyrka represented the first stage of a long and brutal journey, marking the beginning of a life defined by displacement and forced labor. By the early 20th century, as political tensions intensified and revolutionary movements gained momentum, Butyrka's population swelled dramatically. The prison became overcrowded, strained beyond its original design. These conditions were not accidental, but were a direct result of the state's reliance on incarceration as a primary method of controlling unrest. When the Russian Revolution finally erupted, Butyrka stood as a silent witness to the collapse of the old order. Having served Tsars and imperial officials for generations, the prison was poised to be inherited by a new regime, carrying with it a long-established legacy of repression, fear, and state control that would continue to shape its role in the years ahead. Butyrka Prison's location in Moscow was no coincidence. It was a deliberate decision shaped by political, administrative, and security considerations. Positioned close to the heart of Russia's capital, the prison allowed authorities to maintain immediate control over detainees considered important or dangerous. Its proximity to government offices, courts, and security agencies made it an efficient instrument of state power. Being situated in Moscow meant that Butyrka could rapidly receive prisoners arrested during political crackdowns, protests, or investigations. Suspects could be transferred directly from interrogation centers to the prison without long journeys, reducing the risk of escape and limiting public visibility. This efficiency reinforced the state's ability to act swiftly against perceived threats. The central location also allowed Butyrka to function as a key hub within the broader Russian penal system. Prisoners from different regions were often brought to Moscow for questioning before being redistributed to labor camps, exile settlements, or other prisons. As a result, Butyrka became a crucial transit center linking arrests to long-term punishment. For political prisoners, Moscow's significance made detention in Butyrka especially intimidating. Being imprisoned so close to the centers of power symbolized the state's dominance over the individual. Many inmates understood that their fate was being decided just beyond the prison walls, within offices occupied by officials who would never see their suffering firsthand. The prison's placement within a densely populated urban area also carried psychological consequences. While inmates were isolated behind stone walls, life in Moscow continued just outside. The sounds of the city, traffic, voices, distant movement, served as a cruel reminder of freedom and normalcy denied to those inside. At the same time, the location helped authorities maintain secrecy. Despite being in the capital, the prison's high walls and controlled access ensured that conditions inside remained largely hidden from the public. This separation allowed harsh practices to continue with limited scrutiny, even as society evolved around it. Over time, Moscow expanded and modernized, but Butyrka remained fixed in its original position. What was once a strategic site on the city's edge became surrounded by urban development. This transformation intensified debates about the prison's continued presence in a modern capital. The enduring placement of Butyrka in Moscow reflects how deeply incarceration and control were woven into the structure of the Russian state. Its location ensured that punishment was never distant or abstract, but instead embedded directly within the political and symbolic center of the nation. The architectural design of Butyrka Prison was conceived not merely for confinement, but as a physical expression of authority and fear. Built in the late 18th century, its structure followed the principles of fortress-style construction, emphasizing strength, isolation, and control. Massive stone walls, narrow windows, and iron gates were deliberately incorporated to ensure that escape was nearly impossible, and that prisoners felt constantly overpowered by their surroundings. The layout of the prison was designed to limit movement and visibility. Long, dimly lit corridors connected tightly packed cells, allowing guards to monitor prisoners while restricting interaction among inmates. This design reduced opportunities for communication and collective resistance, reinforcing a sense of isolation even in overcrowded conditions. Cells within Butyrka were small, poorly ventilated, and sparsely furnished. Thick walls trapped cold during winter and heat during summer, making the environment physically exhausting. The architecture itself became a tool of punishment, amplifying discomfort and weakening the physical and mental resilience of those held inside. Observation and control were central to the design philosophy. Guard towers, barred walkways, and strategically placed checkpoints allowed prison authorities to oversee large sections of the facility. Prisoners were constantly aware of being watched, a psychological pressure that reinforced obedience and submission. The prison's courtyard areas were enclosed and heavily monitored, offering little relief from confinement. Even outdoor spaces were designed to prevent any sense of openness or freedom. High walls blocked the view of the outside world, ensuring that prisoners remained disconnected from society beyond the prison grounds. Over time, as the number of inmates increased, the original architectural design was pushed beyond its limits. Cells intended for a small number of prisoners became severely overcrowded, yet the rigid structure left little room for adaptation. This mismatch between design and population intensified suffering and deteriorated living conditions. Despite renovations and modifications over the centuries, the core architectural identity of Butyrka remained unchanged. The same walls that once confined imperial prisoners continued to hold Soviet detainees and modern inmates, carrying the weight of historical continuity. Butyrka's architecture stands as a silent enforcer of state power, demonstrating how design can be used not only to contain bodies, but to shape behavior, suppress resistance, and leave a lasting psychological imprint on those forced to live within its walls. From its early years, Butyrka Prison became closely associated with the detention of political prisoners. individuals whose primary offense was opposition to the ruling system. Unlike common criminals, these inmates were often educated, outspoken, and driven by ideological beliefs that challenged imperial authority. Their presence transformed Butyrka into more than a criminal facility. It became a central instrument for suppressing dissent. During the 19th century, as revolutionary ideas spread across Russia, Butyrka increasingly housed activists, journalists, writers, and members of underground movements. Many were arrested for distributing banned literature, organizing secret meetings, or advocating political reform. The prison served as a warning to society that questioning the state could lead to severe consequences. Political prisoners in Butyrka were often subjected to stricter surveillance than ordinary inmates. Authorities feared the spread of revolutionary ideas within prison walls, leading to isolation measures and constant monitoring. Conversations were restricted, correspondence was censored, and any attempt at organization was harshly punished. Interrogation played a central role in the experience of political detainees. Many prisoners endured repeated questioning aimed at uncovering networks, allies, and future plans. These interrogations were designed not only to extract information, but to exhaust and psychologically destabilize the accused. Despite the oppressive conditions, political prisoners often formed informal networks of solidarity. Through coded messages, whispered conversations, and shared intellectual discussions, they resisted complete isolation. These acts of quiet defiance helped preserve their identity and purpose in an environment designed to erase both. As regimes changed, the categories of political prisoners shifted, but the practice remained constant. Tsarist officials, Soviet authorities, and later governments all used Butyrka to detain those labeled as enemies of the state. Each era brought new justifications, but the underlying function of repression endured. The presence of political prisoners gave Butyrka a powerful symbolic meaning. It became known as a place where ideas were imprisoned alongside people, where freedom of thought was treated as a threat. This reputation spread beyond Russia, shaping international perceptions of the country's justice system. Through the stories of its political prisoners, Butyrka Prison reveals how incarceration was used as a political weapon. The experiences of these detainees highlight the human cost of silencing opposition and the enduring struggle between authority and individual conscience. With the rise of the Soviet Union, Butyrka Prison entered one of the darkest and most intense phases of its history. The new regime inherited the prison from the Tsarist system, but quickly adapted it to serve Soviet ideology and state security needs. What remained unchanged was its core function, detaining those deemed a threat to the ruling power. During the early years of Soviet rule, Butyrka was used to imprison former imperial officials, landowners, clergy, and anyone suspected of opposing the Bolsheviks. As the state consolidated control, the prison became a key holding center for individuals accused of counter-revolutionary activities. Arrests were often sudden, and prisoners were brought to Butyrka with little explanation or legal clarity. Under Joseph Stalin, Butyrka's role expanded dramatically. During the Great Purge of the 1930s, thousands passed through its cells, accused of espionage, sabotage, or ideological disloyalty. Many prisoners were arrested based on forced confessions or fabricated charges, turning the prison into a gateway to labor camps or execution. Interrogations during this period were systematic and relentless. Prisoners were subjected to intense questioning designed to extract confessions, often regardless of guilt. The fear generated within Butyrka was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to break resistance and maintain absolute obedience to the state. Overcrowding became extreme during the Soviet era. Cells built for a handful of inmates were packed with dozens, leaving little room to sit or sleep. These conditions intensified physical suffering and spread disease, yet they were tolerated as part of the system's broader disregard for individual welfare. Butyrka also functioned as a transit prison within the vast gulag network. Many inmates stayed only briefly before being transported to forced labor camps across Siberia and Central Asia. For these prisoners, Butyrka represented the terrifying first step into a system from which many would never return. The psychological atmosphere inside the prison was defined by uncertainty and fear. Prisoners rarely knew the length of their detention or their ultimate fate. This constant unpredictability was one of the most effective tools of control used by Soviet authorities. Throughout the Soviet era, Butyrka Prison stood as a symbol of repression and state terror. Its role in mass arrests and political persecution left a deep scar on Russian history, embedding the prison in collective memory as a place where ideology overpowered justice and human dignity. Interrogation was a central feature of life inside Butyrka Prison, shaping the experience of countless inmates across different political eras. From the Tsarist period through the Soviet regime, questioning was used not merely to gather facts, but to assert dominance and control over the accused. Prisoners often arrived at Butyrka knowing that their real ordeal was only beginning. Interrogations were frequently long, repetitive, and mentally exhausting. Inmates could be summoned at any hour, deprived of sleep, and forced to answer the same questions again and again. This method was designed to wear down resistance, leaving prisoners confused, disoriented, and increasingly vulnerable to suggestion. The pursuit of confessions was often prioritized over truth. Investigators operated under pressure to produce results, especially during periods of political repression. As a result, guilt was frequently assumed in advance, and interrogations were structured to confirm predetermined conclusions rather than uncover objective facts. Psychological pressure played a major role in extracting confessions. Threats of harsher punishment, harm to family members, or indefinite detention were commonly implied or directly stated. For many prisoners, fear for their loved ones proved more powerful than fear for themselves. Isolation was another key tactic. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement or denied contact with other inmates, weakening their sense of reality and self-worth. In this state, confessions, true or false, became a perceived escape from endless uncertainty. In some cases, prisoners were encouraged to implicate others, expanding the cycle of arrests. Confessions obtained in Butyrka often became the basis for further investigations, reinforcing a system built on suspicion and self-perpetuating repression. The emotional impact of these interrogations was long-lasting. Even those who survived imprisonment carried deep psychological scars, including anxiety, guilt, and trauma. The act of being forced to confess, especially to crimes never committed, destroyed trust in justice and authority. Interrogation practices in Butyrka Prison reveal how confession became a weapon of the state. Rather than serving justice, the process functioned as a tool to enforce obedience, silence opposition, and maintain an atmosphere of fear that extended far beyond the prison walls. Overcrowding became one of the most defining and brutal realities of life inside Butyrka Prison. From the late imperial period through the Soviet era and into modern times, the number of inmates frequently exceeded the prison's intended capacity. Cells designed for a small group of prisoners were often forced to accommodate many times that number. As arrests increased during periods of political unrest and mass repression, overcrowding intensified rapidly. New prisoners arrived daily, yet the physical structure of Butyrka remained unchanged. This imbalance turned confinement into a daily struggle for basic survival, where space itself became a scarce and valuable resource. In severely overcrowded cells, prisoners had little room to sit or lie down. Sleeping arrangements were often rotated, with some inmates standing or resting in shifts. The lack of personal space heightened tension, frustration, and conflict, further deteriorating already harsh conditions. Ventilation in overcrowded cells was extremely poor. With dozens of bodies packed into enclosed spaces, air became stale and suffocating. This environment contributed to exhaustion, headaches, and the rapid spread of airborne diseases, especially during harsh Russian winters. Sanitation suffered greatly under overcrowding. Limited access to toilets, washing facilities, and clean water led to unhygienic conditions. Inmates were forced to live amid filth, reinforcing a sense of humiliation and physical decline that weakened both body and spirit. Overcrowding also increased the risk of violence. With little supervision inside cells and constant stress, disputes could quickly escalate. Stronger prisoners sometimes dominated weaker ones, creating informal hierarchies that added another layer of fear to daily life. Medical care was inadequate for the growing population. Illnesses spread rapidly, and many prisoners went untreated due to a lack of resources. Overcrowding turned minor health issues into serious, sometimes fatal, conditions. The persistent overcrowding in Butyrka Prison was not merely an administrative failure, but a reflection of a system that prioritized control over human welfare. By allowing such conditions to persist, authorities demonstrated a willingness to accept suffering as an inherent part of punishment and repression. Disease was a constant and deadly presence within the walls of Butyrka Prison, closely linked to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and neglect. From its earliest years, the prison struggled to maintain basic hygienic standards, but during periods of mass incarceration, health conditions deteriorated rapidly. Illness spread easily in cramped cells where prisoners lived in close physical contact. Tuberculosis was one of the most feared diseases inside Butyrka. Poor ventilation, damp conditions, and weakened immune systems made inmates highly vulnerable. Once an outbreak began, it moved quickly from cell to cell, often going unchecked due to a lack of medical isolation facilities. Other infectious diseases, including typhus, dysentery, and influenza, also took a heavy toll. Contaminated water, inadequate food, and unclean living spaces created an ideal environment for these illnesses to thrive. For many prisoners, sickness became as threatening as interrogation or sentencing. Medical care inside the prison was severely limited. Doctors and medicine were often in short supply, and treatment was delayed or denied altogether. Prisoners with serious conditions were frequently left in their cells without proper attention, their suffering ignored by an overburdened or indifferent system. Malnutrition further weakened inmates, making recovery difficult even from minor illnesses. Rations were insufficient in quantity and poor in quality, depriving prisoners of the nutrients needed to survive harsh conditions. Hunger and disease reinforced each other in a destructive cycle. Mortality rates rose significantly during times of political repression and mass arrests. Deaths were often recorded with little detail, and families were rarely informed promptly or honestly. For the state, prisoners who died in custody were statistics rather than individuals. The psychological impact of constant illness and death was profound. Inmates lived with the awareness that survival was uncertain, and that disease could claim anyone at any moment. This environment intensified fear and hopelessness, breaking down mental resilience. Disease and mortality in Butyrka Prison reveal how neglect can become a silent form of punishment. Without overt violence, the conditions themselves slowly destroyed lives, leaving behind a legacy of suffering that remains deeply embedded in the prison's history. Psychological torture was one of the most pervasive and damaging aspects of imprisonment in Butyrka Prison. Unlike physical abuse, its effects were often invisible, yet deeply destructive. Authorities relied heavily on mental pressure to control prisoners, break resistance, and enforce submission without leaving obvious marks. Isolation was a primary tool of psychological torment. Many inmates were held in solitary confinement for extended periods, cut off from human contact and meaningful interaction. This isolation distorted a prisoner's sense of time and reality, leading to anxiety, hallucinations, and emotional breakdowns. Uncertainty about the future intensified mental suffering. Prisoners were rarely informed about the length of their detention, the charges against them, or their eventual fate. This constant state of not knowing created a feeling of helplessness, making resistance seem futile. Constant surveillance further eroded psychological stability. Prisoners were aware that guards could be watching or listening at any time. Even within cells, privacy did not exist. This environment forced inmates to censor their thoughts, speech, and behavior, gradually internalizing control. Interrogation tactics extended beyond questioning. Silence, sudden summons, and deliberate delays were used to keep prisoners in a heightened state of fear. The anticipation of interrogation often became more terrifying than the questioning itself. Sleep deprivation was another method frequently employed. Prisoners were woken repeatedly at night for counts or questioning, preventing rest and weakening mental resilience. Exhaustion made inmates more susceptible to suggestion and emotional collapse. The cumulative effect of psychological torture was long-lasting trauma. Even after release, many former prisoners suffered from depression, paranoia, and an inability to trust others. The prison's influence followed them far beyond its walls. Psychological torture in Butyrka Prison demonstrates how control of the mind can be as devastating as physical violence. Through isolation, uncertainty, and fear, the system dismantled individuality, leaving lasting scars on those who endured it. Despite the oppressive environment of Butyrka Prison, cultural resistance quietly emerged as a powerful form of survival and defiance. Prisoners found ways to preserve their humanity through creativity, intellectual exchange, and shared memory, even under constant surveillance. These acts, though subtle, challenged the prison's goal of total psychological domination. Poetry and writing became vital tools of resistance. Many inmates composed verses in their minds when paper was unavailable, later memorizing and sharing them through whispers or coded messages. Words allowed prisoners to express fear, hope, and identity in a place designed to erase individuality. Storytelling played a crucial role in sustaining morale. Prisoners shared personal histories, philosophical ideas, and political beliefs during rare moments of interaction. These exchanges transformed cells into temporary spaces of thought and reflection, countering enforced silence. Music, though often forbidden, also became a form of quiet rebellion. Prisoners hummed melodies or tapped rhythms on walls, signaling presence and solidarity. These sounds reminded inmates that they were not alone, reinforcing a sense of collective endurance. Education and intellectual debate flourished informally. Former teachers, writers, and scholars passed knowledge to others, discussing literature, history, and science. Learning became an act of resistance, asserting the value of thought in a system that sought obedience over understanding. Religious faith offered spiritual strength for many prisoners. Silent prayers, shared beliefs, and symbolic rituals helped individuals cope with fear and suffering. Faith provided meaning in conditions where logic and justice seemed absent. These cultural expressions also served as emotional anchors. By engaging in creativity and shared identity, prisoners resisted despair and preserved their sense of self. Even the smallest acts of expression carried deep significance. Cultural resistance in Butyrka Prison illustrates the resilience of the human spirit. Though physically confined and psychologically pressured, inmates used culture, memory, and creativity to assert dignity in a place designed to strip it away. Over the centuries, Butyrka Prison held many individuals whose names later became significant in Russian history and culture. These famous inmates came from diverse backgrounds, including writers, revolutionaries, political leaders, and intellectuals. Their imprisonment added to Butyrka's reputation as a place where influential voices were silenced. Among the most notable figures were revolutionary thinkers who opposed the Tsarist regime. Many were detained for spreading radical ideas or organizing resistance movements. Their confinement in Butyrka symbolized the state's fear of intellectual and ideological challenges. Writers and poets also passed through Butyrka's cells. For them, imprisonment became a defining experience that shaped their work. Some later described the prison's conditions in memoirs and literature, exposing the reality of incarceration to the outside world. During the Soviet era, prominent political figures accused of treason or ideological deviation were held in Butyrka. Their arrests often shocked the public, demonstrating that no one was immune from repression. Fame and status offered no protection once the state turned against an individual. Foreign nationals were also imprisoned in Butyrka, particularly during periods of heightened suspicion and espionage fears. Their presence highlighted the prison's role in international politics and Cold War tensions. The detention of well-known individuals increased the prison's symbolic power. Butyrka became associated not just with punishment, but with the suppression of ideas capable of influencing society. Each famous inmate added another layer to its historical weight. For many of these prisoners, time spent in Butyrka marked a turning point. Some emerged with strengthened convictions, while others were psychologically scarred. Their experiences reflected the broader impact of political imprisonment on human lives. The stories of famous inmates transformed Butyrka Prison into a historical landmark of repression. Through their voices and legacies, the world gained insight into the realities of imprisonment and the cost of challenging authority. Over time, Butyrka Prison evolved into one of Russia's most powerful symbols of fear and repression. Its name alone was enough to instill anxiety in the public, representing the consequences of defying authority. For generations, families whispered about Butyrka, knowing that entry often meant suffering, disappearance, or death. The prison's reputation spread far beyond its walls. Arrests followed by transfer to Butyrka signaled serious accusations, especially political ones. Being taken there suggested that the state had identified someone as a significant threat, reinforcing an atmosphere of suspicion and silence within society. Fear was not limited to those imprisoned. The existence of Butyrka influenced everyday behavior, discouraging open discussion, criticism, or dissent. People censored their words and actions to avoid attracting attention, allowing fear to shape social norms and personal relationships. During periods of mass repression, Butyrka became a central node in a network of terror. Its constant flow of prisoners demonstrated the scale of state control and the vulnerability of ordinary citizens. The prison functioned as a visible reminder of invisible power. Inside the prison, fear was carefully cultivated. Uncertainty, isolation, and the threat of severe punishment kept inmates in a state of constant tension. This internal atmosphere mirrored the broader climate of fear imposed on society outside. The symbolic power of Butyrka persisted even after political changes. Memories of its role in repression were passed down through stories, literature, and personal testimonies. The prison remained embedded in collective consciousness as a place of suffering. Internationally, Butyrka became associated with Russia's harsh penal traditions. Human rights organizations and historians cited it as evidence of systemic abuse and lack of transparency in the justice system. As a symbol of fear, Butyrka Prison illustrates how institutions can transcend their physical function. Through history, it became a psychological tool, shaping behavior, controlling thought, and leaving a lasting imprint on national memory. Human rights concerns have long surrounded Butyrka Prison, drawing criticism from activists, journalists, and international organizations. Reports over the years have highlighted issues related to overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and the treatment of detainees, raising serious questions about compliance with basic human rights standards. One of the most persistent concerns has been the condition of pre-trial detainees. Many prisoners in Butyrka were held for extended periods without conviction, often under harsh conditions. This prolonged detention blurred the line between punishment and due process, undermining the principle of presumption of innocence. Access to legal representation has also been a major issue. Detainees frequently reported limited contact with lawyers, restricted communication with families, and obstacles to preparing an effective defense. These limitations weakened accountability and increased vulnerability to abuse. Medical neglect remained a recurring problem. Inadequate healthcare facilities, shortages of staff, and delayed treatment placed prisoners' lives at risk. Human rights observers documented cases where treatable illnesses worsened due to lack of timely care. Allegations of ill treatment and psychological pressure further intensified concerns. Former inmates described coercive interrogation practices and degrading living conditions. While physical abuse was often difficult to verify, the cumulative impact of neglect and intimidation was evident. Transparency was limited, making independent monitoring difficult. Restricted access for journalists and human rights groups allowed problems to persist largely unseen. This lack of oversight contributed to a culture of impunity within the prison system. International pressure increased as reports reached global audiences. Organizations advocating for prisoner rights cited Butyrka as an example of broader systemic issues within Russia's detention facilities. Human rights concerns surrounding Butyrka Prison highlight the ongoing struggle between state security and individual dignity. The prison's history serves as a reminder that justice systems are measured not only by laws, but by how they treat the most powerless individuals under their control. In the modern era, Butyrka Prison remains operational, yet its role and future have become subjects of intense debate. Once positioned on the outskirts of Moscow, the prison is now surrounded by dense urban development, making its continued function increasingly controversial in a rapidly modernizing city. The aging infrastructure presents significant challenges. Much of Butyrka's structure dates back centuries, and despite renovations, it struggles to meet contemporary standards for detention facilities. Cramped cells, outdated ventilation systems, and limited medical spaces continue to raise concerns among human rights advocates. Russian authorities have periodically discussed plans to close Butyrka or relocate its inmates to newer facilities outside the city. Proposals have included transforming the prison into a museum or cultural site, preserving its historical significance while ending its use as a detention center. Public opinion remains divided. Some view Butyrka as a necessary part of the justice system, while others see it as a symbol of outdated and abusive practices that no longer belong in a modern society. For many, the prison's history overshadows its present function. International scrutiny has also influenced discussions about Butyrka's future. Reports from rights organizations continue to draw attention to conditions inside, pressuring authorities to consider reform or closure. These external voices add to domestic debates over transparency and accountability. Despite ongoing discussions, progress has been slow. Bureaucratic delays, funding constraints, and political considerations have prevented decisive action. As a result, Butyrka continues to operate in a state of uncertainty. For inmates, modern-day Butyrka remains a harsh environment. While some conditions have improved compared to earlier eras, many structural problems persist, limiting meaningful reform. The current status of Butyrka Prison reflects the tension between history and change. It stands at a crossroads, balancing its role as a functioning prison against growing calls to confront its legacy and redefine its place in contemporary Russia. Butyrka Prison's historical legacy is deeply woven into the broader narrative of Russian power, punishment, and control. Across centuries, the institution outlived empires, revolutions, and ideological shifts, yet continued to serve as a mechanism through which the state exercised authority over individuals. This continuity gives Butyrka a unique and troubling place in history. The prison reflects how incarceration was repeatedly used as a political instrument rather than solely a tool of justice. From Tsarist rulers to Soviet leaders and beyond, Butyrka functioned as a space where dissent was contained and opposition neutralized. Its legacy is therefore inseparable from the history of repression. Collective memory plays a major role in Butyrka's legacy. Stories passed down through families, literature, and personal testimonies ensure that the experiences of prisoners are not forgotten. These narratives shape public understanding of the prison as a symbol rather than just a building. Butyrka also serves as a historical lesson about the consequences of unchecked power. The prison's long record of abuse, neglect, and fear demonstrates how legal systems can be distorted when authority operates without accountability. For historians, Butyrka offers valuable insight into the evolution of Russia's penal system. Its archives, architecture, and documented experiences reveal patterns of governance, control, and resistance across different eras. The prison's legacy extends beyond Russia's borders. Internationally, Butyrka is often referenced in discussions about political imprisonment, human rights, and state repression, making it a global symbol of authoritarian justice. As debates continue over its future, Butyrka's historical weight cannot be ignored. Whether preserved as a museum or remembered through testimony, its past demands recognition. The legacy of Butyrka Prison ultimately lies in its ability to remind society of the human cost of repression and the enduring need to protect justice, dignity, and freedom of thought. Butyrka Prison stands today not only as a structure of stone and iron, but as a witness to centuries of human struggle. Its walls have absorbed the echoes of fear, resistance, silence, and survival, reflecting the shifting faces of power across Russian history. From imperial rule to modern times, the prison has remained a constant presence while ideologies rose and fell around it. The story of Butyrka is ultimately a story about people, those who were confined, those who enforced authority, and those who lived in the shadow of its reputation. Their experiences reveal how easily justice can be reshaped by fear, and how institutions can outlast the values that created them. As the future of Butyrka remains uncertain, its past demands remembrance. Whether as a functioning prison or a preserved historical site, its legacy challenges society to confront uncomfortable truths about punishment, power, and accountability. Remembering Butyrka is not about the walls themselves, but about ensuring that the suffering endured within them is neither denied nor repeated.